I was highlighting row 42 on the quarterly risk projection spreadsheet. When the knock came, it was a soft, hesitant sound, the sort of knock made by someone who did not want to deliver the message they were carrying. I did not look up from my screen. The numbers in the strategic logistics column were bloated, which meant Preston Miller had been shifting operational expenses around again to make his Q2 margins look better than they actually were. I made a mental note to check the transaction logs with Clara Finch in accounting later that afternoon. "Come in," I called out, my eyes still fixed on the screen. The heavy oak door of my office clicked open and shut. Heavy, slow footsteps crossed the carpet, stopping just short of my desk. When the silence stretched past 5 seconds, I finally lifted my gaze. It was Owen Brady, a junior associate in the compliance department. He was fresh out of law school, having joined the firm less than 6 months ago, and he usually looked like he was permanently worried about saying the wrong thing. Today, he looked like he might throw up. He was holding a company tablet in his hands, his knuckles white around the casing. "Gerald," he said, his voice cracking slightly before he cleared his throat, "you have been terminated." I blinked once, letting the words settle in the quiet of my office. "Terminated?" Owen nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Yes, HR routed the notice. They have already deactivated your security badge. As of 10 minutes ago, you are no longer on the active employee roster." I looked at the digital clock on my wall. It was 9:11 a.m. I looked back at Owen. "That is highly unlikely, Owen. I am scheduled to lead the board meeting in exactly 20 minutes. Preston is waiting for me to present the new risk mitigation protocols." "Are you sure you did not misread the distribution list?" He did not reply. Instead, he stepped forward and placed the tablet on my desk, turning the screen toward me. On the display was a PDF file with the official letterhead of Oak Ridge Systems. The document was titled Executive Separation and Mutual Buyout Agreement. At the bottom of the page in the signature block was my name, Gerald Cole. Next to it was a signature, written in neat, looping cursive, followed by a digital notary stamp and an execution timestamp. 8:07 a.m. I stared at the signature. It looked remarkably like my handwriting. The loops on the G, the sharp angle of the C, the slight tail at the end of the line. It was a very good copy, but it was not mine. I had not signed a single document this morning, and I had certainly not agreed to a voluntary buyout. "Where did this come from, Owen?" I asked. My voice remaining calm, it was uploaded to the compliance database. "Directly from the executive suite," Owen whispered, casting a quick glance toward the hallway as if he expected security to appear. "Sharon was the one who authorized the badge deactivation. She told me to come down here and make sure you left the premises before the board convened." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my lap. Sharon was Victoria Ross, our chief compliance officer, a woman who had spent the last 5 years aligning herself with Preston Miller's faction. Preston was the 32-year-old CEO of Oak Ridge Systems, a man whose father had founded the company, but who had retired 2 years ago, leaving his son with an empire he did not know how to run, and a board he was desperate to impress. I had been at Oak Ridge for 24 years, serving as the director of strategic operations. I knew where every asset was hidden, every liability was buried, and every regulatory corner had been cut. To Preston, my experience was not an asset. It was a threat. I looked at the signature on the screen again. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forgery is a felony, especially when it involves corporate contracts or financial instruments. A forged signature on a buyout agreement meant the contract was void, ab initio, completely invalid from the very beginning. But as I sat there, looking at the digital stamp, I realized that proving the forgery would take weeks of legal filings and forensic handwriting analysis. By then, the board meeting would be over, the new restructuring plan would be approved, and Preston would have already consolidated his power. I did not have weeks. I had 20 minutes. I smiled, a small, tight movement of my lips that did not reach my eyes. "Tell you what, Owen. Walk with me." Owen blinked, his jaw dropping slightly. "Walk where, Gerald? Your badge is deactivated. If security sees you in the elevator lobby, they will escort you out." "They can try," I said, rising from my chair. I picked up my leather portfolio, slid my reading glasses into the front pocket, and smoothed down the lapels of my charcoal blazer. If Preston and Victoria think a forged PDF, is enough to keep me out of that boardroom. They have forgotten who wrote the access bylaws for this building. Let us go. I have a presentation to give. Owen hesitated, looking at the tablet in his hands as if it were a live grenade. But he did not want to stay in my office alone, so he followed me out into the corridor. The hallway was quiet, the carpet muffling the sound of our footsteps as we walked toward the executive elevator lobby. My mind was not racing. In my line of work, panic is a useless emotion. Instead, I was running through the internal architecture of Oak Ridge Systems. I had survived 3 corporate mergers, 2 hostile takeover attempts, and 4 different chief executives. I had survived because I never fought my battles on the ground my enemies chose. I built my own ground, and I waited for gravity to do the rest. When we reached the elevator, Owen swiped his security card. The scanner flashed red. My guest clearance was revoked too, he said, his voice rising in panic. We are locked out. I did not say a word. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small brass key that had been on my keyring for 15 years, and inserted it into a physical keyhole hidden behind the fire extinguisher cabinet next to the elevator shaft. I turned it clockwise. The elevator doors slid open immediately, revealing an empty cabin. It was an old manual override designed for the maintenance crew, a system that had never been integrated into the digital network. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the penthouse suite. Owen followed, his eyes wide as the doors closed and we began to ascend. We did not speak during the ride. I watched the floor indicator lights change, counting the seconds. 5 floors, 50 seconds. Just enough time to mentally review the 2003 operating agreement of Oak Ridge Systems, a document that Preston had likely never read, and Victoria had likely assumed was obsolete. The elevator bell chimed as we reached the top floor. The doors slid open, revealing the polished marble lobby of the executive suite. Straight ahead, behind double-glass doors, was the boardroom. I could hear the faint murmur of voices from inside, the clinking of coffee cups, the relaxed laughter of directors who believed the future of the company was secure. I walked toward the doors, my leather portfolio tucked under my arm. Owen trailed behind me, clutching the tablet like a shield. I reached for the brass handle, paused, and looked back at him. I suppose we are about to find out how much a signature is actually worth, I said. And then I pushed the door open. The boardroom went completely silent. 7 directors sat around the polished glass table, and at the head of the room was the projection screen glowing with the title slide of my presentation. My empty chair at the end of the table sat waiting, and I walked over and pulled it back, sitting down as if I had just stepped away to grab a cup of water. Preston Miller, who had been holding a custom ceramic mug with his initials on it, froze mid-sip. The mug trembled slightly in his hand, and he set it down on the table with a sharp clink. Next to him, Victoria Ross looked down at her notepad, suddenly deeply interested in her own notes. "Gerald," Preston said, his voice tight, "what is the meaning of this? You are not supposed to be in this building." I didn't answer right away. I opened my leather portfolio, pulled out my agenda sheets, and laid them out. Beside me, Owen Brady stood like a statue, clutching the tablet. "Owen," I said quietly, "read the notice." Owen cleared his throat, his voice trembling. As of 8:07 a.m. today, Gerald Cole has been removed from the active roster per the executed executive separation and mutual buyout agreement. His security access has been deactivated. Preston leaned back, a smug, relaxed look returning to his face. He adjusted his silk tie and looked around the table. "Well, Gerald, it seems the decision has already been made. HR has processed your severance. While we appreciate your years of service, your presence here is no longer required. I think it is best if you let Owen escort you out." I looked around the table. The older directors, like Walter Henderson, who had been with the company since its founding, looked confused. The younger ones, hired under Preston's administration, looked uncomfortable. "I understand your position, Preston," I said, my voice level. "But before I leave, we need to address the origin of this document. It is a matter of compliance, which I am sure Victoria would agree is paramount." 3 weeks earlier, I had been sitting in this exact room, listening to a presentation about operational efficiency, when I noticed the first crack in the foundation. It wasn't a sudden confrontation or a dramatic argument. It was a calendar invitation, or rather, the lack of one. The quarterly budget planning session was a standard meeting that I had attended every single year for over 2 decades. But when Clara Finch from finance stopped by my office on a Friday afternoon to ask if I wanted to reschedule my slot, I realized I had never received the invite. "Did you move the strategy review?" Clara had asked, leaning against my doorframe with a stack of ledger sheets. "Preston's assistant sent out the agenda, but your name wasn't on the presenter list." I had smiled, nodding smoothly to cover the discrepancy. "Ah, yes, we are adjusting the timing. I will check with them." I didn't check with them. In a corporation like Oak Ridge Systems, asking about a missing meeting invite is like telling your executioner you noticed the blade is dull. It gives them time to prepare. Instead, I went back to my computer and pulled up our internal security logs. My administrative credentials were still active, but my access to the executive database had been quietly flagged for review. The second clue arrived 2 weeks later, courtesy of Toby Webb, a junior analyst in corporate development. Toby was a bright kid, but he was chronically overworked and had a habit of sending emails before verifying the autocomplete addresses. He had meant to send the new proposed organizational chart to Victoria Ross. Instead, he sent it to me. I opened the attachment on a Sunday night at home. The new chart did not show my name. My entire department, Strategic Operations, was marked for absorption into a new hybrid entity called Planning and Logistics. The head of this new group was listed as Gavin Pratt, Preston's former college classmate and a junior manager whose primary accomplishment was spending $200,000 on a consultant report that recommended we change our corporate font. I did not get angry. I did not call Preston, and I did not send a fiery email to HR. Anger is an expense I cannot afford. Instead, I poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened a yellow legal pad. On the first page, I wrote the names of our current board members. I categorized them into 3 columns: allies, opportunists, and ghosts. On the second page, I listed our primary assets, our outstanding liabilities, and our active regulatory compliance frameworks. And on the third page, I wrote a single name in capital letters: Ironwood Holdings LLC. Ironwood was a dormant entity I had created in 2007 during a real estate investment venture. The venture had ended years ago, but I had kept the LLC active, paying the annual Delaware registration fees and maintaining the registered agent address. I had kept it because I knew that in this business, a clean, dormant entity is like a spare key to a locked house. You hope you never need it, but you are glad it is there when the locks are changed. I picked up my phone and called Roger Doyle, my personal attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Roger," I said, "I need to reactivate the corporate proxy structure for Ironwood, and I need it done before the end of the month." Roger didn't ask questions. He had been my lawyer for 12 years, and he knew that when I called him at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, the rain had already started. "I will have the Delaware filings completed by Tuesday morning, Gerald," he said. "Are you expecting trouble?" "No," I replied. "I am expecting an exit. I just want to ensure I own the door." 10 days before the board meeting, I sat in my office with the blinds drawn, reviewing the digital drafts of the transition protocols. I had logged into the administrative portal using the credentials of my former assistant, Chloe, who had left the company last year, but whose network profile had never been fully decommissioned by our IT department. Chloe had been a dedicated employee, but her password hygiene was non-existent. She used her dog's name and the year of her graduation for everything. Through her account, I quietly initiated the standard knowledge transfer protocol. It was a dense bureaucratic document that HR used to transition responsibilities from outgoing executives to their successors. Nobody ever read these files. They were simply checked off by compliance and archived. I filled the transition document with irrelevant details, detailed descriptions of minor projects, and a completely fabricated strategic initiative called the Opal Matrix Assessment. I made it sound technical and critical enough to occupy Gavin Pratt's attention for months, ensuring he would be too busy deciphering my charts to notice the real changes I was making to the database structures. The real changes lay in the corporate equity registry. Oak Ridge Systems had 3 distinct classes of stock. Class A shares were publicly traded on the open market. Class B shares were held by active executives and strategic partners. subject to vesting schedules and employment conditions. Class C shares, however, were a relic from the company's early days. They had been issued to the original founders and early advisors who had provided seed capital 20 years ago. These shares were non-voting in standard matters and did not pay regular dividends, which is why the current finance team had long ignored them, but I had not ignored them. I held 5 Class C shares, which had been transferred to my investment entity, Ironwood Holdings LLC, during the 2008 restructuring. Buried deep within the 2003 operating agreement, a document that was scanned as a low-resolution PDF in our archives, was Section 6.3. The clause was clear. In the event of an involuntary executive separation that was not authorized by a formal board vote or a documented ethics violation, the strategic voting proxy and administrative authority of all Class C shares would automatically revert to the original holder of record. Preston Miller and Victoria Ross had wanted to fire me quietly, avoiding a messy public dispute or a formal board vote that might raise questions about the company's Q2 performance. They had opted for a retroactive buyout agreement, fabricating my signature to make it look like a mutual separation. They believed that by locking my account and deactivating my badge, they had stripped me of my standing. They did not realize that the moment they filed the forged buyout agreement in the corporate registry to justify my badge deactivation, they officially triggered an involuntary separation. I had spent the last week working with Roger Doyle to finalize the proxy transfer. We did not file it through the company's internal servers. Instead, we filed the updated LLC registration and the share proxy assignment directly with the Delaware Secretary of State. On Monday morning, Roger sent me the certified filing documents. The registration was complete, the proxy was active, and the transfer of voting authority from my individual name to Ironwood Holdings was legally binding. I looked at the documents on my desk, feeling the cold weight of the law. Under the Delaware Limited Liability Company Act, specifically, Section 18-304, the terms of an operating agreement are strictly enforced as written. There is no room for corporate interpretation or executive discretion. The law does not care about Preston's titles or his father's legacy. It only cares about the agreement. I sent a short text to Roger. The filing is complete. Let the board meeting proceed. I then spent the rest of the week preparing my presentation. I did not focus on the buyout or the forgery. I focused on the numbers. I gathered every transaction record from the past 3 months, every unauthorized transfer to Gavin Pratt's logistics firm, and every compliance waiver Victoria Ross had signed without board approval. I compiled the evidence onto a single flash drive, which I placed in my portfolio. I was not planning to argue my case in a courtroom. I was going to present it to the people who owned the company. On the morning of the board meeting, I arrived at the office at 8:30 a.m. I did not go to the lobby. I waited in the coffee shop across the street until 9:05 a.m., watching the executives and directors arrive in their black sedans. I saw Preston walk in, looking confident, adjusting his cuffs as he spoke to a junior associate. I saw Victoria Ross walk in, holding a folder of documents. At 9:10 a.m., I walked across the street, entered the building through the loading bay, and used my key to access the elevator. Now, sitting in the boardroom, I looked at Preston. His face had gone pale, his confident posture collapsing as he looked at the tablet Owen was holding. "This is a mistake," Preston said, his voice dropping an octave. "We will take this offline, Gerald. We can discuss a transition period." I opened my folder and pulled out the Delaware Certified Proxy document. "There is nothing to discuss, Preston," I said. "The transition has already occurred." I slid the Delaware Certified filings down the long glass table. They stopped directly in front of Walter Henderson, the senior director. He adjusted his glasses, opened the blue backing paper, and began to read. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning vents humming in the ceiling. Victoria Ross leaned forward, her face tense. "Preston," she whispered. "What is that?" Preston didn't answer. He was staring at me, his knuckles white against the edge of the glass table. Walter Henderson finished the first page, then looked up, his eyes moving between me and Preston. "Gerald, this document shows that Ironwood Holdings LLC holds the strategic voting proxy for all legacy Class C shares, and according to this notary stamp, the proxy was activated 3 days ago." Yes, Walter, I said. That is correct. But those shares are non-voting. Preston blurted out, his voice rising in pitch as he tried to regain control of the room. They have been dormant for 15 years. They don't have standing in a quarterly review. Under normal circumstances, that would be true, I replied, keeping my voice low and steady. But these are not normal circumstances. Victoria, I assume you have a copy of the 2003 operating agreement in your database? Victoria's lips thinned into a straight line. She didn't move. Owen, I said, turning to the junior associate, please pull up section 6.3 of the 2003 agreement on your tablet and project it onto the screen. Owen fumbled with the screen for a second, his fingers shaking, and then tapped the display. The projected image on the wall shifted from my quarterly risk presentation to a scan of a dusty, double-spaced legal document. The text was faded, but the words were unmistakable. I read the clause aloud for the room. In the event of any involuntary executive separation that is not authorized by a majority vote of the independent directors or a documented breach of the corporate ethics code, the administrative control and strategic voting proxy of all Class C shares shall immediately revert to the original holder of record, notwithstanding any subsequent individual resignation or severance agreement. I looked at Preston. The original holder of record for those 5 Class C shares is Ironwood Holdings, LLC. And since my termination was processed this morning without a board vote or an ethics review, Section 6.3 was triggered. This is ridiculous. Preston snapped, standing up so quickly, his chair rolled back against the credenza. You signed the buyout. We have your signature on the digital agreement. It was notarized at 8:07 this morning. You can't trigger a reversion clause if you accepted the severance. I stood up as well, placing my hands flat on my portfolio. I looked at Victoria Ross, who was still staring at her notepad. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forgery is a felony, I said, my voice echoing in the silent boardroom. The signature on that buyout agreement is not mine. I did not sign it, and I did not authorize my digital certificate to be used. In the eyes of the law, a forged contract is void ab initio. It does not exist. It has no legal standing. Preston scoffed, though his voice sounded thin. That is a bold claim, Gerald. You are going to accuse legal and HR of forgery? We have the digital logs. We have the IP address of the submission. I am not accusing anyone, Preston, I replied. I am presenting the facts. Under California law, a forged document is invalid, but because your administration processed the termination in our database, you established the fact of my involuntary separation. You deactivated my badge. You locked my accounts. You filed the paperwork with our payroll provider. You created the trigger event, and the operating agreement executed the reversion automatically. Victoria Ross slowly reached out and pulled the Delaware filing folder toward her. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages, looking for a loophole, a missing signature, a filing date discrepancy. Her fingers traced the notary's stamp from Roger Doyle's office. Preston watched her, his breathing shallow. Victoria, he said, tell them it's invalid. Tell them he doesn't have standing. Victoria didn't look at him. She turned the page, her face growing increasingly pale as she read the UCC-1 financing statement and the Delaware LLC amendment. Preston, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The filings are clean. The registration was recorded in Dover on Monday. So what? Preston demanded, turning on her. We can dispute the signature. We can hire a forensic analyst. We can tie this up in court for the next 2 years. We could, I said, leaning forward. But while you are disputing the signature in court, the operating agreement remains in effect. And under Section 6.3, the holder of those Class C shares has the authority to suspend all strategic decisions and executive appointments pending a full investigation by the independent directors. I looked at Walter Henderson. Walter, as the lead independent director, the authority now rests with you and the board. Ironwood Holdings has frozen the Q2 restructuring plan. Preston cannot sign the merger agreement with Kestrel Systems this afternoon, and he cannot appoint Gavin Pratt to the logistics department. Walter Henderson looked at the projected clause on the wall, then at Preston, and finally at me. He closed the blue folder with a heavy thud. Preston, Walter said, his voice cold. I think you had better sit down. Preston Miller did not sit down. He stood by the head of the table, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he looked around the room. The board members were no longer looking at him. They were looking at the folders in front of them or at the presentation screen. "This is a setup," Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "Gerald, you have been planning this." "I didn't plan your actions, Preston," I said, reaching into my portfolio and pulling out a silver flash drive. "I simply prepared for them." "Walter, if you would allow me to present the rest of the strategic review." Walter Henderson nodded once. "Proceed, Gerald." I handed the flash drive to Owen, who inserted it into the console. The projector screen shifted again, displaying a spreadsheet titled Q2 Capital Reallocations and Compliance Log. "This is the real reason. Preston and Victoria needed me out of the building before this meeting," I said, directing the board's attention to the first column. "Over the last 3 months, Preston has authorized 3 separate transfers totaling $427,000 from our regulatory compliance budget to a secondary fund labeled Strategic Talent Acquisition. That fund was used to pay upfront retainer fees to Cascadia Ventures, a logistics consulting firm owned by Gavin Pratt's cousin." A murmur of surprise went around the table. Julian Cox, the director who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "Was this approved by the audit committee?" "It was not," I replied. "The transfers were masked as software licensing renewals, which is why Clara Finch was not notified. Victoria Ross signed the compliance waivers, bypassing our dual signature protocol. Furthermore, I have documented $38,000 in personal expenses charged to the corporate card during Preston's trip to Scottsdale last month, with no clients present." "This is administrative error," Preston stammered, his face turning red. "It is an accounting discrepancy. We were going to reconcile it at the end of the fiscal year. It is a breach of fiduciary duty," Walter Henderson said, his voice flat. "And it is a violation of our internal bylaws." "It is more than that," I continued, switching to the next slide. "This is a copy of the investor memorandum sent to our primary capital partners last week for the Q3 bridge funding raise. On page 4, Gavin Pratt is listed as the Chief Operating Officer of Oak Ridge Systems. This board has not voted on his appointment. By representing him as an executive officer to secure capital, the firm has engaged in material misrepresentations, exposing us to federal securities fraud liabilities under Rule 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The room went completely cold. The directors looked at the slide, then at Preston. "Unbelievable," Julian Cox muttered, rubbing his temples, but the final blow was not the financial records. I tapped my remote, and the screen displayed a scanned letter on the letterhead of our corporate liability insurance provider, Liberty Alliance. "I contacted our insurance agent yesterday afternoon," I said. "Under Clause 14D of our policy, the insurer denies all indemnity coverage for executive liability in the event of due diligence failure. The policy states that if the corporation terminates a key strategic officer without seeking formal legal counsel or board review, the coverage is void. Because Preston rushed the buyout agreement and forged the signature to avoid review, our D&O insurance is void for this transaction. Preston is personally liable for any shareholder lawsuits resulting from this action." Preston sank back into his chair as if the air had been let out of him. His hands rested on the table, and he stared at the letter on the wall, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man who had just realized he had cut his own safety rope while standing on the edge of a cliff. Walter Henderson stood up, buttoning his blazer. "I think we have heard enough. I move to call a formal vote for the immediate removal of Preston Miller as Chief Executive Officer of Oak Ridge Systems, pending a full forensic audit of the Q2 accounts." "Seconded," Julian Cox said. "All in favor?" Walter asked. Every director around the table raised their hand. Even Victoria Ross, after a long hesitation, slowly lifted her hand, her eyes fixed on the table. "The motion carries," Walter said. "Preston, you are relieved of your duties effective immediately. You will leave your security badge and company devices on this table. Security will escort you from the building." Preston did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he unclipped his security badge, placed it on the polished glass next to his monogrammed mug, and stood up. He did not look at me. He walked toward the door, his steps heavy, and walked out of the room. Gavin Pratt followed him, his head low. Walter Henderson turned to me. "Gerald, the board will need to appoint an interim CEO to stabilize the company and handle the audit. We would like to propose your name." I smiled, a genuine relaxed expression this time. I closed my portfolio and zipped it shut. "Thank you, Walter," I said. "But I must decline. I did not trigger the reversion to take the throne. I triggered it because the foundation was rotting, and I wanted to clear the termites out of the walls. If you want my recommendation, you should appoint Clara Finch. She has been in our finance department for 12 years. She knows every line on our ledger, and she has never looked the other way." Walter looked at the other directors, who nodded in agreement. "We will call a closed session to review her appointment," he said. "But what about you, Gerald?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sealed white envelope. I placed it on the table in front of Victoria Ross. "My formal resignation," I said, "signed with my own pen, effective tomorrow morning. I have spent 24 years building this company, and I think it is time I enjoyed the retirement I actually earned." I nodded to the board, turned, and walked toward the double-glass doors. Owen Brady followed me out into the lobby, still holding the tablet. "Gerald," he said, his voice carrying a mix of awe and relief, "what do I do with this?" "Keep it, Owen," I said, pressing the button for the elevator. "You are going to need it to help Clara clean up the mess. And remember, never sign a document you haven't read, and never assume the person in the corner office doesn't know where the keys are hidden." The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, turned to face the lobby, and smiled as the doors slid shut. I was no longer the fixer. I was just a retired man with a clean record, a brass key, and a very good pen.